Hello, and welcome back to the Real Zero podcast with me, Daniel Brandt.
And me, Hugh Montgomery.
How you doing, Hugh?
Not so bad. Busy old week. What about you?
Yeah, I've had a very good week, thank you very much. And Hugh, this has been a big week, hasn't it? A lot of things have been going on in politics in the US when we're recording. Do you want to say how you feel about that kind of thing?
As we're recording this, we're Thursday, Trump inauguration Monday. First thing he did, signed an executive order to pull out the Paris climate deal, which is, we could talk about another time maybe about the implications from that, but that's, I guess, have been heavily flagged before. We had the Institute of Actuaries and Insurers report coming out on Monday talking about a loss of 50% or more of the global economy within 50 years and the consequent societal impact. So I think that rather got lost in the Trump inauguration stuff. So yeah, a lot of big ticket stuff going on at the minute. Really good week.
Well, yeah, not a bad week, but like you said, a lot of things have been going on in the States, which have been really interesting. But more interesting than all that, Hugh, is that we've got a great guest on today.
We have.
All the way from LSE, let me introduce Liz Robinson. Hello, Liz.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so Liz, just give us a bit of a background. Who are you?
Well, at the moment, right now I'm acting dean of our new global school, Sustainability at London School of Economics. I am trained as an environment development economist, but increasingly working on food security, health and climate.
Fantastic. How did you get into that? What's your background into that field?
Peripatetic?
The best. Best win to him.
I think my Damascene moment was I had my daughters with me on sabbatical in China in 2015 when there was some of the worst air quality in Beijing and the first red alert when they shut the schools, which is about the only place where my kids could get clean air. And it got me thinking, that a country like China that's done so well in reducing poverty, improving living standards, improving healthcare, there's a lot of middle-class people who are breathing really polluted air. I'm thinking, hang on, this doesn't make sense. And then you start thinking there's a lot of the way we live at the moment that really doesn't make sense. And the way we might want to live better in terms of air quality, how we move around, what we eat, is actually the kind of things that could tackle climate change as well.
Fair. Well, Hugh, already you have a question that you'd like to ask all our guests.
Yeah, so we'll start with the first one, because I should say that Liz and I know each other because Liz and I had worked on the Lancet countdown on health and climate change for a long time. I do some of the medical-y bits, and you've done a lot of the money bits and the foodie bits. So, question though, how long before human civilization is severely impacted by climate change? We're told that, people will take notice when we're back to how long before that happens?
So it depends how you define severely, but we're already getting affected by climate change, and the kind of work I do with Dr. is making clear already that we can actually attribute worse health outcomes, worse food security outcomes to the change in climate.
And it doesn't stop here, I guess. It's going to get worse, right?
It's going to get worse, and particularly if you look at low middle-income countries that are working so hard to reach sustainable development goals, and because of climate change, it's just making it that much harder. And if temperatures increase to sort of 3 degrees and above, it's going to be pretty bad.
Good. Can I start there? Because you made me think of something there. So this is one of the things with climate change. Everyone thinks about foreign people in poor countries being hit by climate change. And we've had this narrative for ages. They're the ones who will suffer worse. They're the ones who don't. But food, it seems to me, is a global thing, right? When I go to the local shop, I have to seek out broccoli from Britain. Okay,
It's a very middle class.
I know it is possible. But the food on the shelves, it's Kenyan string beans, and it's the stuff that's processed. Goodness knows where it come from. If food is food global, but tell me a bit about that. How is most of the food we eat in Britain made and manufactured and farmed here, or is there international trade? Are we very dependent on each other, I guess is the question.
We're highly dependent on each other, and we're highly dependent on a small number of crops. So there's a lot of concentration. So when markets are working properly and when we don't have a lot of shocks, it makes sense to have integrated markets. And so, if it's more efficient to grow food in one part of the world and to ship to another part of the world, that's great. And so that's a good thing. And, in terms of low middle income countries, trade, not aid, is something we hear a lot. So, if we're buying those beans or the broccoli you're looking for in our local return supermarket, if it comes from a low middle income country or somewhere else, it's not necessarily a problem. The transportation is not the problem. But what we're noticing now is with climate change, we're getting these distinct shocks, ripple through the supply chains. And then this sort of idea that this just-in-time management of food becomes problematic.
Right. So again, we've talked in other podcasts, people involved food supply chains, about the impacts of food production on the climate change. So the 100 million tons of methane from rice paddy fields and shipping and refrigeration and cows belching 250 litres of methane each a day and all of those other things. So 38% of greenhouse gases, to remind our audience who've heard it before, come from the food supply chain. 22% of global heating comes from methane, all of that's in there. So we do have to obviously adjust what we eat to stop climate change. So that's the impact of food supply on climate change. But you've alluded there to the impacts of climate change on the food supply chain. So give us a quick rundown. How does climate change impact food production?
So, we need to. I think we need to think about a sort of slow creep of climate change, which is increasing temperatures, and then we need to think about the fact that we're in more extremes of weather. So, we know that the gradual increasing heat is problematic for most crops. We know that the increasing carbon dioxide, despite what you might hear on certain parts of the internet, although yes, crops like carbon dioxide, we're really worried now that the increasing carbon dioxide concentrations can reduce the nutrient value of a lot of crops. So the slow creep over time is damaging sort of the potential.
And I suppose with that comes the sea level rise and loss of coastal land and salt spray coming in to some extent.
Yeah, to some extent, I think it's the rapid sea level rise that's going to be more problematic. But we've already got the sort of seawater incursions. But that's linked to a lot of other issues. So reduction of aquifers and stuff. But so there's a lot of those sort of creeping problems that we need to deal with. And so the crop breeders are. Well, I've been saying this for 30 years. We're still a big crop breeding for drought resistance, flood resistance, heat tolerance. And then
Pests, I guess. Plant pests are changing too, aren't they?
pests and diseases are changing, exactly, the changing temperatures. So farmers that didn't used to have to worry about certain pests now have to worry about different kinds of pests. And so I've got a PhD student looking at locusts in East Africa and how they're affected by change in weather patterns.
I mean, I know we've got a lot more to talk about, but you've just listed, we've got, yes, there'll be some salt. We've got desiccation of soil and loss of soil from tilling. We've got the droughts and potentially fires and flooding and extreme hot and cold, all sorts of other bits and bobs, and pests. Is it going to be a technical fix to that? I can see that you might be able to breed something that resists a fungus or is less tasty to a locust, but can you really breed the plants to cope with all of those hits? Is that possible to get a technical fix?
I'm the wrong person to ask, but it's going to be difficult, isn't it? We know that. But there's quite a lot that crop breeding can do.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, we have to do that. But that's been a process for sort of 10, 20, 30 years. And we know that the soils are tired, so increased fertilizer of soils is really important, especially in African countries. And then there's the extremes, the weather shocks.
Right.
So increasing weather shocks, we had one, was it last year, when we lost sort of 20% of our wheat crop and 20% of our barley crop.
Yeah.
But did we really notice in the UK? Not yet. But, if we go back to 2008 food crisis, and these days it's not about if there's going to be another, it's when.
Right.
So you've had the 2008 food crisis, you had the 2010-11 food crisis, we had the food crisis precipitated by the invasion of Ukraine. So we keep having food crises, and some of them are caused by weather and some aren't. But with 2008 food crisis, we had, I forgot what your question is, what we're talking about today, Peg. So, we had successive droughts in Australia.
Right.
And that was the trigger. So it was a trigger that we're going to see more and more of. And Australia is a country where actually for a few decades, crop production was benefiting from climate change. So it's actually probably benefiting from a bit more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And now you start to see crop yields stalling in Australia. It may well be climate change. But anyway, you get these successive shocks. And to some extent, that needs to be a problem because there's a lot of food around the world. I mean, you sort of alluded to that at the beginning. There's tons of food.
Yeah, let's just touch on that one because this is something that still confuses me, right? If there's so much food around the place, why have we got starving people in huge sections of the world? And why have we got food banks in Britain where people can't afford it and we're told that we can't get rid of junk, ultra-processed foods which poison people because they're cheap foods and it's the only way to feed people? Why have we got this problem? If there's so much food around, why have we got food poverty in Britain and food poverty in, let's say, the water?
Okay, so this podcast is going to be about 2 hours long, right? We've asked about 6 questions. Where do we go back to? So we can go back to Amartya Sen, who sort of basically said you don't get famines in when you have democracy. I mean, that's very, very much paraphrasing. But what he was really saying is that if you've got information flows, and if you know that food is scarce somewhere, the price is going to go up. That triggers an economic signal that people then, it makes sense to buy food where it's less expensive and to transport. So that's your whole sort of economic arbitrage conversation that if you've got scarcity of food, people should ship the food in. But it's changing now, isn't it? I think it's changing with climate change. Then there's the other so that's one thing that we used to be able to say and we can't anymore. The other thing we used to be able to say is, as long as you keep reducing poverty in the world, food security and nutrition is going to get better. And so till about 2015, you could say, okay, as long as we focus on those sort of general development aims and growth, but we got bifurcation in about 2015, 2016. So now, COVID years accepted, we see poverty continue to go down, but the bifurcation so that food insecurity and nutrition is going up again. So this sort of separation means something's going on at the global level. Could be inequality, could be increasing conflict, probably a lot. It could be soil, a lot. It's probably due to climate change. You look at the UK situation, okay?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to answer all 6 of your questions. The UK situation, yeah, so here we are, a rich country, plenty of food, and yet increasing use of food banks, increasing evidence of children going to school hungry, not being able to eat, increasing evidence of parents, heat or eat. We've heard that many times. Do we eat or do we heat our homes? And that's a poverty issue. That's inequality and poverty. And so it's a really problematic conversation when people say, okay, food needs to be cheaper.
Right.
Because exactly your point, we can produce lots of, low quality, low grade processed food that's cheap and easy to eat. So in the UK, the problem's not price of food. It's the fact that we have poverty.
Right.
And in the UK, we're already picking up the impact of climate and weather on food insecurity. So when we get bad weather, price of fruit and vegetable goes up, low-income people can't afford it. That's one of those measures of food insecurity. Can you afford healthy, nutritious variety of food?
And that's really interesting. And it takes us back to some thoughts. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, you may remember, produced the report related to the heat wave in Kazakhstan in 2010, where the grain crop collapsed. Kazakhstan, normally a massive exporter, became a net importer. That pushed the price of wheat up around the world. Speculators jumped on it. The price went from $150 to $360 a metric ton. We all had it buffered by supermarkets to keep us getting in buying red wine and toilet cleaner. And in the 10 states that couldn't, and IISS attributed to that, they had the Arab Springs triggered by that. Which then, of course, leads to mass migration into the Syrian capital, destabilised Syrian government, migration there, and Brexit. So these shocks on food systems that you're alluding to sound to me like they can have pretty big geopolitical consequences.
Yeah, and you could argue that the regime change in Haiti in 2008 was due to droughts in Australia. So the similar things happen. So once you get that shock, so you get a weather shock, and the question is whether that's amplified across the globe or whether it's dampened. It's how people respond, right? So when we had a weather shock in Australia that harmed the wheat harvest, we found the price of rice increased way more than the price of wheat, and that's all part of how do you respond. So you keep alluding to the toilet paper conversation during COVID, during lockdown. Okay, what did people do when they were like? All of a sudden, everyone rushed and bought toilet paper. So there's plenty of toilet paper in the country, but it wasn't in the supermarket. So if you were like a superior being and went, I'm not going to panic buy, I'm just going to be a responsible person, you go to the supermarket, there's nothing there. It's happened with petrol as well in the UK. I can't remember how many years ago.
I remember that.
Remember, we were warned there might be a petrol shortage. Everyone went and filled up their car. Panic. And everyone was like snarky, a little bit snarky about people who went and filled their car up with petrol. So there's tons of petrol in some people's cars. But you go to the petrol station, not that we drive electric vehicles, of course, but you go to the petrol station and there's no petrol. So it's individually rational behavior you see after these shocks, which is to hoard or put on export bans. WTO, the World Trade Organization, can't stop an individual country putting on export bans. And so there's a sort of tightening of the market, pushes the prices up. Rice price spikes more because it's a thin market, so not much rice is traded. And you get these huge ripples.
And I guess people speculate today. I mean, on
speculation too, yeah. Which is the opposite of the sort of Amartya Sen, if information says. Because the opposite speculation is if there's a shortage somewhere, you think the rational thing is food moves to where there's a shortage. The speculation is the opposite. If there's a shortage, you hold on to the grain, speculating the hope that the price goes even higher.
So this is interesting. So for me, because it's making me wonder how we get out of this. So let's imagine we're seeing these increasing heat waves, floods, droughts, fires, etc., etc. Let's imagine we get the bifurcation of the northern jet stream, which we had a couple of summers ago, and of course that rather impacted badly crop production all around the world. Italy, the last time I looked, reckoned it had lost 9 or 10 billion to its food production. It was 20% down on fruit, 20% down on grain and dairy. Big hits, and that was across the globe, but manageable. If we had a really big hit globally, this could be seriously bad, right? Because all of those factors that you just explained come into play.
Yeah.
And maybe we're all finding it difficult to access or afford food. How do we, obviously, I think we take it as read that we've got to try to stop, we've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to stop it happening. But given that we've got this happening and it's going to get worse, how do we, as individuals, governments, globally in markets, how do we protect ourselves from this? Is there an answer?
It's not easy. I think because it requires a lot of cooperation. And when things go bad, cooperation tends to sort of be one of the first things that disappears.
Right.
So we certainly need cooperation in terms of making sure that food still moves around the globe, that we don't get the hoarding. We probably need more storage. So I'm trying to think back in the sort of 80s, and I know I allude a lot to low and middle income countries, but to some extent, what we're going to experience in the future in high income countries is what's already been experienced in low and middle income countries. So we can learn a lot. So countries were encouraged to reduce their storage of grains, their strategic grain reserves, and to rely on trade instead. Again, fine when things are sort of functioning. So probably need more storage. We need more cooperation. But we've also, I think we can't have this conversation without talking about that transition to net zero, how food's got to change anyway. So we feed almost half of our grains to cows and to cars, so we've got about sort of 40% of grains going to livestock, which is, meat might be a good nutrient dense protein source, but I think it's 100 calories of grain makes you 12 calories of chicken or 3 calories of beef. So it's really inefficient, and we know it's damaging the sort of biodiversity and ecosystems. So there's a transition, I think, we have to transition to more plant-based meals in a way that doesn't harm our farming community, because it's the farmers that are going to keep us eating for the next decades. We have to think about, how we eat, what we eat, and probably diversify. So humans basically now eat maize, rice, wheat, soy.
And usually one species for each of those.
Oh, yeah. And so, we really need to diversify there. We need to diversify who the big exporters are. So 80% of maize exports come from 4 countries. So you can imagine when a breadbasket country has a shock, whether it's your Kazakhstan or whether it's Australia, whatever, when they have a shock, that's really going to ripple through, because
there aren't many others,
yeah. And because so little rice is traded, that if there's sort of 5-6 major rice exporters, if their harvests go down by 10%, the rice market disappears because they're only trading about 5 to 10% their surplus.
Let me ask you another question, because my knowledge of agriculture is limited to having tended a window box and maybe a bit of gardening with my dad when I was younger, and listening to Farming Today in the morning.
As we do.
But how do we help the farmers here? Because whenever you hear the farmers on Farming Today, it seems to me that pretty much all of them are on the breadline. None of them are rich. They're not making a lot of money. They're often being squeezed by the supermarket so that they're getting virtually nothing, which I guess we benefit from, right? We go to the supermarkets and the food is relatively cheap, or cheaper than it would be if the supermarket was not squeezing the farmer. How do we support farmers to transition away from, let's say, cattle globally or in this country towards plant-based, and also make it profitable for them? Not least of which, because we're going to get those shocks, aren't we? One year they might just lose their entire crop. What should we put in place? If I made you the Minister for Agriculture, and also, by the way, you can run the Treasury and be Prime Minister at the same time.
Right.
What do you think what are you going to do?
First of all, I think there's not any easy solutions.
Right.
I think we've got to be realistic about that. We've also got to be realistic. This is a transition. But I think, first of all, we've got to recognize, you sort of talked about supermarkets squeezing farmers to keep food cheap for people. But just because they're squeezing the farmers doesn't mean the food's cheap for us. But actually, food is relatively cheaper now than it has been in the past. So we spend a relatively small proportion of our income on food. But again, like I alluded to, we've just got too much poverty. There were ways one could do, post, the common agricultural policy, and I think we're of similar age. So, growing up as kids, what did we learn about the butternut mountain?
That's good.
So if you really want to incentivize food production, you can. That's not hard. But the question is how you balance that with the demands of ecosystem services and the fact that, if we talk about the UK, we're one of the most nature depleted, high income countries. So it's not simple. But certainly supporting farmers in terms of, I think, changing the balance of power a little bit between supermarkets and farmers would help a lot. We know, for example, our dairy farmers, they really do get squeezed by supermarkets because supermarkets want milk as a loss leader. So there's situations like that. But the hard conversation, I think, is still to be had about livestock farming. So in the UK, we have some of the highest animal welfare. We have some of the lowest emissions. So, if you're going to do livestock farming, you do it like the UK, but we will have to transition over time out of that. So I think we can't just look at farmers separate from the fact, for example, that, most of the fish our fisher folk catch, we don't eat. We export all to Europe. A lot of the fish that's farmed out of the oceans is fed to, captive other fish. Yeah, captive fish. So the whole food system's kind of messed up. And so we need a whole reset of the food system. We can't just sort of talk about farmers in isolation of the whole system.
So before I go to Dan, because Dan no doubt will have a pile of questions for us, what's your takeaway for me as a punter on the street, right? What can I do other than voting or engaging in a conversation? What do I do with my money on a day-to-day basis that might help this when I go to do my food shop?
I think we do need to have more plant-based diets. So most of us in somewhere like the UK probably need to eat less meat. If you're going to eat meat, buying British is a good idea.
And poultry, guess, and pork as opposed to cows and sheep that are belching the methane, because poultry has a much, much better carbon footprint, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell people what they should eat. I think it's more of a fact that it makes a lot of sense for our health and the planet to reduce our consumption more generally of meat. But you're right, of course, the ruminants like cows are belching a lot of methane. So it's about sort of balanced diet. So it's about, but that's easy for us to say. We can go and afford, the sort of fruits and vegetables that are often really expensive and out of the reach of some people. So, if you can, that's great. If you can support your local farmers, the farmers markets, that's lovely. We don't necessarily have to buy our food from the supermarkets. There's lots of other ways to buy food if one has time and the ability to reach those. So I think supporting our farmers, supporting British meat if you're going to eat meat is great. That's a good start.
Plant-based if you can.
And
Plant-based,
moving
of course,
towards moving towards more plant-based and less meat for most of us is probably quite sensible.
Dan, you're not, just as I'm not, an agroeconomist or anything in those domains. You are a doctor. What do you make of what you've heard, and what questions do you think you have?
Well, Liz, thanks very much for going through everything. I mean, I'm finding it really interesting to see how the food systems work. It's especially interesting what you say about how you kind of hold on to things when actually it should be shared out. I think that's actually a really interesting thing, which brings in to my mind it's just a bit of human nature. So we almost covered it just now with what you can do. But I guess like consumer behavior is slightly different from individual behavior. And I'm interested in, when we want to change consumer behavior, that's something that happens on an individual level for sure. But what's the kind of top-down thing that might happen, or is it even possible that we can kind of move people towards a more sustainable way forward?
So as an economist, I'd say three things if you want to change stuff. So your environmental policy instruments, there's three of them. You can use pricing mechanisms, so you can tax and subsidize. You can use regulation, and you can nudge. And so a lot of the time when we talk about consumer behavior, we think about nudging. But often you need to combine all three. So, for example, if you want to, when we talk about food, what we want is to ensure that people have healthy diets. So, a good starting point is bring back home economics, to schools. Just make, feed school children good food, hospitals, make sure people have access to healthy food in hospitals so they're not running out of the hospital as quickly as possible, or smuggling food in, So starting point is for children, because, the worst is what we're seeing in high-income countries, that we have malnourishment from too many calories. So we have people who are overweight in high and low-income countries, at the same time in a planet that we have undernourished people. So, you can nudge. Then there's lots of known ways that you can nudge people towards more healthy diets. I mean, simple things like how you lay out food when someone goes to the canteen. Simple ways like teaching kids how to cook, healthy food, so they can take that back to their parents. Normalizing healthy food, so not being able to buy sort of fizzy drinks and high ultra processed foods. That's a good starting point, because you want to set. We need to change norms. About what is a norm, because if you look at I'm going to go a bit outside of food now. But if you look at the way we live our lives at the moment, they're not sustainable. And I hope it's a blip, these last 30 years of how we live and how we have this sort of disposable society, and how our diets tend to be quite unhealthy. So you can nudge, you can regulate, which is a little bit more controversial. People might start worrying about nanny state, but there's things one I think is sensible to regulate, and it's starting to happen, like advertisements. Why are kids seeing adverts to eat sort of multicolored sugar solution, basically, that is supposed to be a healthy breakfast? So that's one way to start to do it. You can regulate supermarkets even in terms of these sort of multi-buy offers, where it makes sense to buy more of something, then you throw half of it away. And then the sort of more controversial one is the tax and subsidy. And so, I've been asked a couple of times about, taxing meat. Why not tax meat if it's a bad thing, and we want to encourage people to have other diets? But, if you tax meat, you don't know if a low-income person is going to suddenly start eating, veggie burgers, or if they're going to actually just keep eating the same amount of meat and buy less fruit and vegetables because they know their kids will eat it.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. It's not obvious what the solutions are.
I mean, that's an interesting point, isn't it, what this is saying there, because it sounds, again, multifactorial. Because if, let's suppose, you put a tax on red meat to reduce that, good for health, good for the NHS, good for the planet, good for everything else. It's all very well if you were to take that money and subsidise, let's say, vegetables. What Liz is making, some kids won't eat it. And the Farmers Union, you might remember a few years ago, came up with the figure, and I forget what it was, but it was well north of 70% of children surveyed in Britain thought that carrots were made in factories.
Really?
They're not.
So, I mean, that sort of distancing of anything from what's a processed food to a natural food, or where it comes from, or that connection's lost. And in fact, I think we were talking the other day, weren't we, sort of randomly, about why it ought to be that we should go back to some of the basics in the schools, that everyone, boy and girl, and anything in between, should perhaps learn how to knit and fix things. It shouldn't be DIY boys cooking girls. It ought to be that we all learn all of those things. And sounds to me, I'd be a fan of that. If we put that back into school, so everyone understood what a healthy food was, and that a fresh carrot or a fresh potato tasted nice, and the mud on the outside of it was not a bad thing, and how to prepare it might be. There you are. So now you're Prime Minister, your first policy.
I've got home economics back into
schools. Dan, other questions or comments?
Well, first of all, I mean, that's really interesting. And we've had this conversation a few times. And actually, I do think we need to get someone from education on the podcast, because, people can sometimes say, oh, this is just boomer thinking or whatever, things were better in my day. But, when I hear my mum and my dad talk about what they did at school, and they were learning things like this, and they were learning about food, and they were actually learning about health. And I initially got interested in it from a health point of view, because obviously, the doctor background, but health education is absolutely terrible. And like you say, it's all intertwined. And if the kids don't understand health and they don't understand food, and then you become an adult, then you're not going to understand anything going forward anyway. So I think there's a big piece around education and starting people young. So yeah, that's one of my take homes there.
Right. So let me wrap up what I think I've heard. You can tell me if I've missed anything, and Liz can tell me if I've missed anything important, got it wrong. I think we've learned that food systems impact climate change. And that we can change what we eat to try to reduce the impacts of climate change. We've learned that climate change impacts food production in a whole raft of different ways. And that because we've got an interconnected food system, when those shocks, as Liz referred to them, happen, from extreme weather events, for instance, it can have unpredictable consequences down the chain because of the way that individuals, countries, and financial markets behave. And that can drive scarcity and price increases, which if you're poor, whether you're in this country or in a developing or lower income country, you find harder to deal with. And I think we've learned that what we can do as individuals is try to move more, if we can afford it, towards a more plant-based diet. We'd like to encourage education in schools to get people connected to that more. And meanwhile, of course, reduce the emissions to try to protect yourself from all this going forward. Is that a rough-ish summary?
Yeah,
It is.
that
Anything
sounds-
else you'd like to add?
No, I think the only thing I'd add is just we need to diversify our diets. Yeah, we're so dependent on just a few grains, and which we discussed first. So yeah, so more diversification would help.
Okay, quickly then, just last 30 seconds then. I do try to do that. Again, because I'm middle class, I can probably afford it. I've got my nuts and my seeds and bits and bobs. But for someone who's basically eating bread, which is wheat, and wheat flour and baked product, and it's a wheat.
Yeah.
And occasionally, maybe once every few weeks, they might have a curry with some rice. How do I diversify those and the vegetables? What are your suggestions of other...
I'm more thinking the food systems need to diversify. Okay. So, we take this back to farming systems. We take this back to the big grain producers,
Right.
The big seed producers. We look for those sort of orphan grains. But yeah, I think you're right. I think I seem to recall reading somewhere, we used to be told 5 a day, fruits and vegetables. And now we're told, why don't you count the number of different things you eat in a week? And I think I read somewhere like, maybe 30 is a good number. Number doesn't really matter, but it's thinking actively to oneself. How many different things am I eating? That's a nice way to start. And then you don't obsess too much about what it is. That's just a way to get variety.
I'm liking this, and it reminds me of the thing which our kids were told when they were at school a few years ago, which was the colours on the plate. Lots of greens and yellows and different shapes. That's perhaps another easy way for people like me who bear a small brain to remember how to diversify.
Well, yes, and it's a nice little way to just do things, a bit like 10,000 steps. I mean, it's kind of meaningless 10,000 steps, isn't it? But if you start thinking, I should do 10,000 steps, you're doing something. So if you've got 30 things on your plate, or over a week, I don't want to say you have the buffet, right? The buffet in Las Vegas. But no, that's just very good.
Well, in which case, I've really enjoyed that. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you for your time. I know you're very busy being the big boss now, so that's wonderful. Thank you for coming. Dan, thank you for coming as well, as ever.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you very much, Liz. And thanks for listening at home as well. So next time, we'll see you next time on the Real Zero podcast. Bye-bye.
The Real Zero podcast with Hugh Montgomery and Daniel Grant. Produced by me, Daniel Grant, aka The Stealth Doctor, on YouTube and Instagram. Find out more about Real Zero by heading to realzero.earth and find out more about how you and your friends can start making a real difference today.